this is the Miss Libertarian podcast and I'm your host, Jess Gill. Today I'm honoured to be joined by the LOLA chapter leader of Canada, Ana Rizo, and today we'll be discussing the economic and political crisis in Venezuela. Ana, would you be able to tell us a bit about yourself?
First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. And well, I'm the chapter leader of LOLA, the Ladies of Liberty Alliance in Canada. I moved to Canada back in 2016. I'm originally from Venezuela, and I'm a lawyer actually back home. So a lot of people, are like, oh, how come the chapter leader of Canada is not a Canadian? Well, like I think that one of the things that motivated me to become part of LOLA and create the LOLA chapter in Canada is exactly the fact that I'm a survivor of socialism. So that's the main reason why I moved here as well.
Great. So, would you be able to give us a brief outline for those who aren't that familiar with Venezuela's political situation and maybe a bit about how it's gotten into that situation?
Well, the Venezuelan political situation is something that is worth mentioning is that a lot of people think like Venezuela prior to Hugo Chavez arrived to power in Venezuela in the late 90s. So, it's been more than 20 years now of a very left leaning regime. And a lot of people think that Venezuela transitioned from right wing to left wing, when the reality, Venezuela just went from left wing to what was considered a social democracy back in the early 90s and also the 80s to more leftist, like extreme left, basically. And that's a transition that Venezuela did, believe it or not, democratically. Like, actually, Hugo Chavez was elected and not only one time but also like twice, three times. And unfortunately what he did is that he turned the Venezuelan political landscape into a more totalitarian and a more centralized control of the economy. So when people ask how Venezuela made it to that situation, well, it requires a long answer, but I will summarize it with, taking the economic decisions that were a complete failure. So when we talk about economic decisions, we talk about government taking over successful companies and nationalization. And not only nationalization, but also like taking them over politically speaking. So the one that is going to be the president of the oil company is going to be a person that is an ally of my political party. Not because this person is actually competent, but because this person is actually loyal to my ideology. So that's something that they did with the oil company, for example. But other companies that were completely private were also taking over. Like one of the examples is Agrisleña, that used to be a company that is focused on the, farming. And it was the biggest company that Venezuela had back then. It was also taking over. And something that we saw with all these expropriations, because this is what it was back in the day, is that the quality and the production just decreased dramatically, which tells you that the government is not a good businessman in the end of the day. So after they destroy part of the, production machine of the country, they decided that, we also like what do you have when you destroy your own production machine? A scarcity. And if you have a scarcity, the few like goods that you get are going to increase in price because offer and demand. Like you don't have a lot to offer, what you get is going to be higher in price. And the government thought that we can fight this with price controls. But the reality is that when you impose a price controls, you also basically destroy the motivation and the incentive to produce. Because why I'm gonna produce something where I'm not gonna make any profit? And what happened was even more scarcity. And I think that's what Venezuela, when Venezuela reached a point that, everyone was looking at my country just making bread lines. Huge bread lines back in 2014, 2015. 2016 and 2017 were even worse because that's when the refugee crisis started to happen because Venezuelans were starving to death. and they started to run away. Literally, they even left by foot to neighboring countries like Colombia, Brazil, and they reached the south. But yeah, essentially, if you ask me, it was just an economic disaster caused by a socialist governance.
So, what has been the reaction? You mentioned refugees. What has been the general reaction of the Venezuelan public? Have they been against the government, reacting against the government? Has there been opposition to that? Or are they in denial, would you say?
I think that many Venezuelans they hate the government. Most of Venezuelans hate the government, like there's no doubt at this point. Venezuelans are kept captive by a totalitarian regime. And Venezuelans, we have an opposition, certainly, but the opposition in many cases negotiate with the government themselves. So it's like a fake opposition kind of thing. And the few political leaders that are actually like going and continue in the fight to get freedom for Venezuela, because it's in the end a battle for freedom, and are actually like demonized by the government or persecuted. Venezuela has many political prisoners even nowadays. So, for example, we are now having an upcoming election, which I'm very skeptical myself because I don't believe that you have real elections in a dictatorship. But one of the political candidates, she was already, um, I think that the word in English is inhabilitated. I don't know, like when they basically don't let them participate in any political election. And this is a strategy that the Venezuelan government has done since 2008. So this is nothing new. They persecute any political leader who might actually go against them and is not part of that control opposition that they have.
So, you're the chapter leader of LOLA Canada, and it's interesting that you've come at this from specifically a women's issue of like how socialism impacts women. So, what brought you towards the women's part of it rather than just general socialism? And how do you think the policies of Venezuela have impacted women specifically?
I think that the policies of Venezuela impacted women in like many aspects. And I always say that when the crisis went to the worst point, women have the worst of all those consequences. Why? Well, especially mothers, when you are a mother and you cannot have your partner with you because your partner has to go away in order to send money back home because the situation is so unstable, you are the one dealing with the worst because you are living in a catastrophe, you are living in a super unstable situation, and you have to rely on your own at this point. Other examples is that for example, Venezuela had the highest mortality rate for newborn babies. These were women that they were giving birth, and 3 months later they were burying their own children. Or in the worst case scenario, like prostitution. Prostitution went higher than ever in Venezuela. Even nowadays, it's like that. And why? Because, I mean, what are you gonna do when you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, you're a teacher, and you're just making 30 US dollars per month? That's ridiculous. And actually, the minimum wage right now of teachers in Venezuela is like 7 US dollars per month. That's nothing. That's misery. So when you are in that situation, many women are in despair. They end up exposed to these scenarios. Other examples is when you become a refugee. You are more likely to end up being a victim of human trafficking. Is that something that we have seen in Colombia? We have seen that in Trinidad and Tobago, where they have found Venezuelans literally in the sex market because they were trafficked. So this is something that has impact especially women in the end of the day, and that's the worst part of it.
So, what lessons do you think that other countries, not just in Latin America, but places like the US or Canada, who are slowly drifting towards statism, what lessons do you think they can learn from the situation in Venezuela?
I always think that the best lessons that they can learn is to keep the government on check, like to keep your politicians accountable. and to don't believe in magic solutions because the state is not going to be the one providing those. Like I always see when they come in Canada, for example, right now we're dealing with inflation. I mean, of course, it's nothing like the inflation that we dealt back in Venezuela, but it's still inflation, and many Canadians are complaining, and they say like, "Oh, it's because of corporate greed," and it's like, no. I mean, you saw what happened during COVID. You saw how the government was spending your money. You saw how they didn't care, and you think that that money came from nothing out of nowhere? No, that's excessive public expenditure. That's printing money, and as Milton Friedman said, the one causing inflation is the government, not because of corporations are becoming more greed out of sudden. Like that's not how it works. And then they come with proposals like, oh, we need to impose price controls, and it's like, look at what happened in Venezuela. When we started to get price control, we actually faced the scarcity. So you're just going to make a problem worse, and people are going to get more angry, and people are going to get in despair. So in the end, you are just bringing economic misery to your nation. And that's some of the lessons that we can learn from Venezuela. Like, don't repeat those mistakes.
So as the leader of LOLA Canada, how do you think we can best spread the liberty message? How best do you think we can warn people against the terrors of socialism?
I think one of the biggest communication tools that we have right now is social media. Like, I just saw a video last week. Sorry that I'm focused on the topic of inflation, but that's a big thing, I believe. And they were explaining, for example, how the carbon tax that the government is imposing, the Trudeau government, is actually making groceries to become more expensive. Because, I mean, you impose a carbon tax, your gas become more expensive. How are you going to transport those goods? You need carbon, right? So usually what happens is that one government action can deal to another consequence. And I think that using social media to spread this message and to explain it to people, but in explaining it in a way that they can understand. Because something that I believe that, and this is where I think libertarians fail, is that they think that everyone is going to understand the complicated concepts of, I don't know, Adam Smith or, I don't know, von Mises. And let's be honest, not everyone is into economics as much. Not everyone is into public policy as much. And a lot of people are not going to understand. But if you explain it with cases, with real cases, a scenario that they can, like see it and be like, oh, this is what is impacting me, then people are easier to get the message, to receive it, and to understand libertarian ideas.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Miss Libertarian. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective and providing more education and clarification on the situation in Venezuela. And thank you so much, the viewer, for watching this video. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I've been Jess Gill. Thank you. Goodbye.